Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. This is where you can find extended interviews of my conversations on public television. I'm Ian Bremmer, and this week I'm checking in on the U.S. government's system of checks and balances. Because two things can be true at the same time. One, every U.S. president tests the limits of executive authority. And two, no U.S. president in modern history has tested those limits quite like President Trump. Just this week, for instance, President Trump's decision to deploy National Guard troops in Los Angeles had critics and constitutional scholars up in arms. And as of early June, President Trump had signed 157 executive orders. That's more than one executive order for every day of his presidency. And it dwarfs the number signed by any of his predecessors this early in a presidency in modern American history. Nor has any president in generations enjoyed a Congress as aligned with his agenda or as acquiescent to his authority as this one. I do not say this lightly. President Trump's efforts in his second term to consolidate power within the executive branch is nothing short of revolutionary. That doesn't mean it's necessarily good or bad, but it is certainly disruptive and very risky too. And unlike anything happening in a major democracy around the world right now. As he attempts to take more and more power away from other branches of government, there remains one particularly important and effective constitutional check on President Trump's authority: the courts. And joining me today to discuss the health of America's judicial branch and to preview the important Supreme Court rulings still to come, Yale Law School's Emily Bazelon. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.
Emily Bazelon, welcome back to GZERO World.
Thanks for having me.
I feel like the judiciary in the United States, an issue where you have a fair amount of expertise, is one of the things that seems to be standing comparatively strong right now. Am I too optimistic about that?
No, I think you're right. Most of the action thus far has been in the district courts all across the country. So we're talking about hundreds of judges reviewing requests for emergency relief from Trump's executive orders. And for the most part, I think they have been trying to apply the law fairly. Most, but not all of the decisions in these cases have gone against the government. I would argue that's because the Trump administration is doing extraordinary things, many of which are illegal.
Most, by the way, as someone who's not been counting them, it feels like 80 to 90%. Is that about right?
It's 80 to 90%. Later in the spring. It started off being fewer, which is interesting. In May, it was over 95%. So I think what you see there are more and more kind of extreme orders from the Trump administration and the judiciary reacting accordingly. Also interesting that the rate of rulings against the government is over 80% from Democratic appointees and over 72% from Republican appointees. So this is really a kind of...
Yeah, so it doesn't really matter. Frankly,
doesn't really matter. And that's important. And there have been rulings against the government from judges who Trump appointed, which he's very angry about. But if you think about our separation of powers and the independence of the courts, is actually a really good sign that judges are trying to apply the law regardless of who appointed them.
Yeah, I mean, you got a 9-0 ruling in the Supreme Court, 9-0 against Trump. And you got to think Alito, like Clarence Thomas, right? Saying, no, you actually can't just send this guy to El Salvador.
Right. So I think when you get to the Supreme Court, which has only had a few opportunities to review the work of the lower courts, what you see is a mixed response. And I think the Supreme Court has been the strongest against the government in these deportation cases where people got zero due process and where lower court judges have built a record showing that. And the justices have been backing them up. They have had the backs of the district court judges in those cases. The other side of the coin is this decision recently in a case where Trump fired one of the folks on the National Labor Relations Board and another agency head. And the court said Trump does have the power to do that.
Can't take the Fed out, but no problem with these other agencies that historically you would have said, no, this is actually a professional external administration.
Exactly. And that's giving Trump more power at a moment where arguably the courts are showing that he's abusing his power in other contexts. It comes on top, of course, of the decision last summer by the Supreme Court giving Trump criminal immunity, which Trump invokes all the time in all kinds of legal filings, whether it's relevant or not. And the other thing is—
And that ruling was fairly specific, right?
It was fairly specific. I mean, it was a wide grant of criminal immunity in particular zones of presidential authority. But I think Trump and his Justice Department have really seized on it with a very expansive interpretation. And I would not say that the court did the best job of making the narrowness of the ruling super clear. And so the administration is kind of running with that. You know, the last thing to say about the independent agencies case is that when Congress established these agencies, it did so and gave them a lot of power, assuming that they would have some independence from the president. And now that's not true anymore. And it's scrambling a kind of legal and political reality that was in place for almost 100 years. So that's a big deal.
5 months in, does the Trump administration feel revolutionary in its intent to you?
I mean, it feels unbounded and unprecedented and an extraordinary use of executive authority and power, and a theory, at least rhetorically, including from Trump himself, which makes it unclear whether he really respects the independence of the courts. So when you go back to the Constitution and separation of powers and the idea that it is the role of the courts to say what the law is, I think at least in terms of his rhetoric, and then some of the actions disobeying lower court orders, that the president is really threatening that structure.
Now, two different levels of courts here that are relevant. We have federal courts that have been ruling quite a bit against Trump. Seems like Trump has been incredibly critical of them, and his cabinet has, and his supporters have. But in almost all of those cases, they have still been largely abiding by those rulings. Some notable exceptions. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. I mean, some notable exceptions is itself historic, right?
Indeed.
I mean, presidents have respected court orders since the founding. So to mess around with that at all, which Trump, the administration, has done in several of the deportation cases, again, that's a very big deal. It is also true that there's whole swaths of law that the administration has been respecting court orders and indeed has not even appealed some of the biggest rulings against it, which is a tell about how strong or weak they think their position is, right?
Or about how many there are, and, you've got to reserve some capital to...
Maybe, but when you try to, tell law firms that they can't do any more government business, and the courts reject that under every provision of the Constitution, starting with the First Amendment, you'd think that if the administration thought it was on strong ground, it would appeal, right? I mean, those were big headlines. Same with the actions against Harvard. They just haven't appealed a lot of it.
And let's start with the law firms, because, that seems pretty foundational to the rule of law, right? I mean, that, you get a vigorous defense no matter who you are in the United States. And Trump has an executive order saying, actually, no, not in the case of this law firm, because I don't like them. I don't like who they've represented. To me, and I'm not a legal expert at all, it seemed as if that was on its face going to be rejected by any justice in the country. What do you think motivates an executive order like that?
Well, first of all, it's vindictive. It sends a message. Even if they lose in court, arguably they have chilled business for these firms, right? Because they're sending this incredibly loud and clear message. We don't like this law firm. If you do government business, maybe you're going to think twice before you hire the lawyers who work for that law firm. So I think that's one reason. And I think there's a lot of just pure vindictive revenge taking going on with some of these orders and just pushing to see what they can get away with. How far can they go?
And as you've said, I mean, at the beginning, there was a Trump administration view that, well, a lot of these judges, federal judges, they're activist judges, they're liberal judges, they're people, look at what they've done in all of these other cases. You can see that they have a bias. And many of these judges do indeed have biases, right? We've seen that. But when there are judges that were appointed by Trump himself, right? I mean, like the recent IEPA case, the trade case, 3 judges on this federal trade court, and they all vote unanimously against the Trump administration. And then Trump goes after the Federalist Society for appointing or suggesting the appointment, I should say, one of the justices. How does that play?
Well, I think that was, again, really a big deal. Trump was having a beef with the Federalist Society basically because he blames the Federalist Society, deeply conservative arm of the conservative legal movement, for judges not ruling his way. In other words, his view of the judges are that they are supposed to do his bidding, right? They're Trump judges.
At least the ones that he appointed, yes.
Yes. And so then you see him nominate to the Court of Appeals Emile Beauvais, who was Trump's personal lawyer, now top official in the Justice Department. And Trump's announcement says that Beauvais is going to make America great again. In other words, it's an explicit statement that Trump expects this judge to be a MAGA judge. That is
to be a political appointee.
That is shocking. That is not how presidents have ever talked about the judiciary. And the idea that you respect the independence, that you understand that there's something called law, which is different from something called politics. And, you know, in the past, you can argue the judges have not followed the law, that they seem in some way biased, like you just said. But that is different from explicitly hiring them in order that they would perform in that way.
Now, Matt Gaetz, of course, was originally nominated to lead the Department of Justice. That was quite spectacularly rejected by some of Trump's own party members. He had to withdraw. Ended up with Pam Bondi. What do you think about that appointment in terms of action so far, precedented, not precedented, in the context that you've just been talking?
You know, Bondi has been really clear that she sees the Justice Department as an arm of the president. And she has been very willing to weaponize it against Trump's enemies. She says that she sees her job, again, as doing the president's bidding. And since Watergate, we have not had that kind of conduct from an attorney general of the United States. There has been this idea, and it's been codified in Justice Department rules. It's not like just some vague norm out there. There has been this real commitment from the Justice Department to have distance from the president, independence. So you don't have people from the White House calling up and telling the attorney general who to prosecute. In this administration, you 100% have that. I mean, we don't even remark upon it all the time anymore because it's becoming common. And so that is a real breach with the past Department of Attorney Generals and the way the Justice Department has functioned, somewhat importantly independent from the White House.
So you're seeing political prosecutions that are being driven right now in the Trump administration?
Yeah, 100%.
Give us a couple
Christopher
examples.
Krebs, who was
Ran CISA,
worked on cybercrime issues in the Trump administration, incurred Trump's wrath because he said that the 2020 election was legitimate.
Was free and fair, yeah.
He is being prosecuted. Miles Taylor wrote an op-ed for the New York Times critical of the Trump administration. He is being investigated. That's a political prosecution, or at least a political investigation so far. And last week we had an order that Trump gave the attorney general to investigate Joe Biden and the Biden administration. That is absolutely, you go after your predecessor for political reasons. Now, of course, Trump would say that that's what happened to him when he was investigated and prosecuted over the January 6th rioting. And then you have to think about whether, maybe that was a different kind of circumstance than what's being alleged here.
And I mean, most people that see this from external perspectives have said that they believe that there was some level of politicization of some of the cases in the way that they were pursued against Trump at the time, specifically in New York, perhaps less so with the classified information in Florida, perhaps less so with the way that January 6th was handled. Do you think it is fair for Trump not to take the actions he is right now, but rather to claim that there was a weaponization of the political system also against him?
So the prosecutions in New York, that was the state district attorney, the state court system. It was not controlled by Joe Biden or anyone who worked for him. And as far as I know, there's no evidence that Joe Biden ever called up his attorney general or anyone in the Justice Department or the FBI and said, you go after that guy. He's my enemy. And I think that is a really crucial distinction, right? It is true that Democrats were in control in New York, and some people thought that the charges that Trump was convicted of by a New York court were kind of like, really got to bring that, it's this hush money scheme. It's only a felony because you're attaching it to these other criminal violations.
And that it wouldn't have been brought against a Democrat in the same situation.
Perhaps not. I mean, I think you can argue that either way. In any case, it is not the same as Trump ordering his attorney general to prosecute or investigate people, because as far as we know, Joe Biden never took a step like that.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.
So let's talk about the Supreme Court briefly. It does appear that President Trump thinks, or at least acts differently about the rulings of the Supreme Court, hasn't challenged their legitimacy, hasn't said that they're a bunch of activists, hasn't gone certainly after his own appointees the way he has with the lower level courts. Do you buy that, and do you think it's likely to stand up?
I think it's true so far. He's been making that distinction. Really important to say that the lower courts are also federal courts with all the power vested in them to issue orders, including, at least thus far, nationwide injunctions. So I don't take
Which is unusual in the U.S. system, right? That you have like a federal justice in some state having a nationwide ruling.
True. And it may be that the Supreme Court is going to actually cut back on what district court judges can do with that regard. But I think the basic point is that I don't think one should take a lot of solace in the idea that, Trump is promising to obey the Supreme Court, because almost every case in the country does not go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Lower court judges are crucial to the system operating. And I think also it's early days. And you could argue that part of what Trump is doing right now is testing the waters to see how much strain he can put on these basic pillars of the democracy and how people are going to respond. And so if we're kind of blasé about the challenge to lower court judges, does that just give him more free rein to eventually try the same kinds of moves against the Supreme Court?
So of all the things coming down the pike soon for the Supreme Court, birthright citizenship is a big one. And so far, at least, the justices seem potentially divided on this issue. Talk about what you expect.
So there's two things happening in this case. One is the merits. Can Trump order an end to birthright citizenship? On that question, the justices actually seem united. None of them wanted to defend Trump's order. However, they are almost certainly not going to reach the merits of that question this June. What is much more likely is they are going to rule on this procedural question about whether district courts can continue to issue what we call nationwide injunctions, these orders where one judge in one courtroom says for the whole country, no, you can't do that, or yes, you can do that.
Which does, on its face, seem kind of excessive, right?
It does seem like a lot of power to give one district court judge.
To give every district court judge.
To give every district court judge. And it means that if you find one who's sympathetic, then you win, or at least you get to block the government from doing something temporarily, right? So one way to think about this question is, if the president orders something, do we want the default to be that that order goes into effect? We live with it. We find out what it's like, right? This is how democratic process works? Or do we want judges to be able to pause everything while the underlying legal questions get resolved on the merits, which can take a couple of years often? So that's like one way to think about this. The justices, you're right, seemed very divided. I think that we can expect they will in some way limit this power of nationwide injunctions that courts have had. And the question will be how far they dial it back. There's a kind of middle ground here where they could say, look, you still have this power, but only national injunction if that is necessary to give the plaintiffs the complete relief they need. And sometimes that is not necessary. Sometimes you have a limited number of plaintiffs in one place, and you can just issue an order with regards to them that does not affect everybody everywhere. And I would also add that we got to talk about Congress here, right? There are three branches of government. The founders never anticipated judges pitted against the president and Congress just like laying down, even though what the judges are trying to do is ascertain and apply laws that Congress enacted, right? I mean, all these funding freeze cases, these are appropriations bills that Congress passed for this year. And the idea that they're just either standing by or even cheering Trump on while he basically like undoes all of their work to fund things is kind of crazy, but that's what's happening.
So the excitement in this field this week, and it's different every week, let's face it, is getting a lot of attention to Los Angeles. We have some very significant protests, a lot of violence, frankly. An LA police department that is trying to contain it, not completely effectively. Trump comes over the top and says, I'm sending 2,000 members of the National Guard. We haven't in 60 years seen a president order National Guard in without the support consent of a governor. And last time it happened, it was to support demonstrators that were in favor of civil rights. So it was a very different political environment.
Absolutely.
What do you think's going on here?
You know, first of all, I think it's important to think about whether the Trump administration provoked this unrest in LA, right? I mean, they were doing immigration enforcement in the Garment District in another part of the city that's largely Latino, pulling people out of their workplaces, doing exactly the kinds of things that gets other people who are connected to the folks getting taken away very upset. And so, you know, there's a way in which there's a feeling of a kind of setup happening underlying all of these facts. Then
let me just push back on that for one moment, because I'm not disputing what you just said, but of course, if these people are in the country illegally, and part of Trump's platform, which he won on, was we're not doing anything to respond to people illegally in the country. I mean, provoking it is exactly not only within the rule of law, but frankly, you could say it was an abdication if he hadn't.
You could argue that. I mean, it is 100% true that they're enforcing immigration laws, right? And that there are lots of people in the country illegally. However, if you were just playing the numbers game, you would go to a poultry factory in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest and pick up a lot of factory workers, right? When you choose to go into the heart of a city, onto the streets and publicly snatch people up, you're kind of asking for a reaction. And you pick a very democratic
Or you're
city.
showing that you're like actually doing something when you don't have the ability to get the numbers that otherwise you'd like to get.
I mean, there you go. It's just the politics play very favorably for the president, right? Because immigration enforcement is an issue in which a lot of Americans, most Americans, at least top level, agree with more enforcement. So you have all those politics as part of the mix. Then you have unrest, and then you have an order. The governor of California, the local law officials, they're not asking for help, right? They're saying we can handle this. But now you have federal troops on the ground, heavily armored. You have this kind of spectacle of, you know, what looks like a kind of federal, extremely strong law enforcement presence. That is itself, again, provocative. You kind of draw more people in. And then you have the situation where there's violence erupting, and then that can be an excuse for even more troops to be called in. And we know that Trump really likes to flex these muscles, right? And so I think that's underlying here what we're seeing.
So what are we expecting to see from the courts as a consequence of all this?
Well, I mean, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is suing.
Mm-hmm.
He
was one of those behind the IEPA suit that eventually ruled in favor of Gavin and others.
Yes, to do with Trump's
the trade.
Tariffs, true.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in the California context, Newsom has a good process argument, which is that, so Trump could have invoked the Insurrection Act.
Which he did not.
He did not. Which, yes. So he's only taken an interim step. I mean, let's remember that the Insurrection Act is sitting there on the shelf and gives the president enormous power, which, maybe Congress should have done something to narrow that a while ago. But there it sits. In the meantime, we have this other statute that allows the president to federalize, to kind of take over the California part of the National Guard. However, the president is supposed to consult with the governor before doing so, and that didn't happen in this case. So that is the process aspect of this lawsuit that Gavin Newsom is bringing. We'll see where it goes. It's one of those things where even if Newsom won, presumably the Trump administration could come back, call him on the phone.
And that's that.
Yes. So there have been a number of those kinds of lawsuits in the courts. They're not really a ticket to ending everything the administration is doing.
So there isn't really, I mean, again, you can say he didn't follow the appropriate process, but the reality is that if Trump wants to use this occasion to bring in troops, legally, it's within his ken.
Yes, and that is arguably a problem with the Insurrection Act. And more broadly speaking, with how the American presidency has become so powerful in our structure, right? I mean, it is not the first branch of government in the Constitution. Congress is. But over time, the executive has really arrogated to itself more and more power that lawmakers used to share in. Congress has gotten much worse at standing up for its own institutional prerogatives. It's become polarized along partisan lines. The Republicans in control of Congress right now seem to care much more about Republican power than they do about institutional congressional power. And so what you see here is one manifestation of extraordinary executive power. And, the framers really, I think, assumed that there would be presidents operating in good faith with the best interests of the country who were in this powerful seat.
That seems a little quaint.
It does seem a little quaint right now, especially because, as I was trying to say before, the structure they set up had more checks and balances in it than ours really does. And I think that, unfortunately, the Insurrection Act and the possibility of it being invoked is evidence of that.
No, which is why you wanted to bring us back to Congress, because that's a major check and balance that clearly just does not function. Impeachment does not function. These have become political tools, right? Not an actual check on the executive.
Yeah, and it's really important to remember that, right? Because if one of the three legs of the stool just kind of disappears, we sort of forget about it. Whereas they're really important to the structure. When they, that makes the stool fall down. The judges cannot save the country from an authoritarian president if we have one by themselves. That's just not a reasonable expectation to have. They can slow things down. They can hopefully make people think. They can stop some actions. But really, this is a system of checks and balances that depends on all three of the parts of it doing their job.
So when you see journalists asking Trump, hey, what do you think about arresting Governor Newsom of California? And when immigration czar Tom Homan has said that he's going to go after anyone that is trying to stand in the way of him implementing these policies, including the governor, does Trump have a legal mechanism where he could potentially order Governor Newsom arrested?
I mean, in theory, I guess, sure. I don't think there's any evidence that Governor Newsom has done anything remotely criminal. So I hesitate to even go down that road. And I think what you're really seeing here is strongman rhetoric, right? Trump really likes to say whatever he wants about the people he perceives as his political enemy. He's scoring points. at Newsom's expense or also at the expense of traditional state sovereignty, right? I mean, usually you have presidents who go out of their way to respect the authority that other office holders around the country have. Trump does not play the game that way.
Emily Bazelon, thanks for being
having me.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Do you like what you heard? Of course you do. Why not make it official? Why don't you rate and review GZERO World? 5 stars, only 5 stars, otherwise don't do it. On Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our lead sponsor, Prologis. Prologis helps businesses across the globe scale their supply chains with an expansive portfolio of logistics real estate and the only end-to-end solutions platform addressing the critical initiatives of global logistics today. Learn more at prologis.com.